Nobelpriset i litteratur år 2016 tilldelas Bob Dylan som skapat nya poetiska uttryck inom den stora amerikanska sångtraditionen. The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2016 is awarded to Bob Dylan for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. Le prix Nobel de littérature pour l'année 2016 est attribué à Bob Dylan pour avoir créé, dans le cadre de la grande tradition de la musique américaine, de nouveaux modes d'expression poétique. Der Nobelpreis in Literatur des Jahres 2016 wird Bob Dylan verliehen für seine poetischen Neuschöpfungen in der großen amerikanischen
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, after coming home from seeing the film about Bob Dylan, his early years, called A Complete Unknown, which, of course, if you know Bob Dylan's music, you know that's a line from his great song, Like a Rolling Stone. Now, when I walked out, my head was buzzing. One of the reasons it was buzzing is because I know that period, the 60s of Bob Dylan, very, very well. I also know a lot of what he did, how he acted, who he was with, why he became famous, and all sorts of other things about him at the time. And, of course, the music. So, as I was walking home, I was thinking, like, okay, what makes this an interesting movie? And how should they have done it differently? My first thought, spoilers. Well, if you don't know Bob Dylan's life history, the whole thing's, you're going to be spoiled. But if you do know some of it, it doesn't actually matter. It is a biopic. And it's made by James Mangold, who's one of those Hollywood directors who has no real specific fingerprint. He's not a Guillermo del Toro, whose work you can always recognize. He's certainly not a Stanley Kubrick. He's certainly not someone you would put in a list of great directors. But he has made some very good films, and he's made some, shall we say, Hollywood tripe, like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which, to be fair, was probably, can be blamed much more at the feet of Kathleen Kennedy. But let's not go there. Let's discuss A Complete Unknown. Now, just to let you know, like I said, I'm completely going to ruin the plot of the movie, because I don't care. It's like, it never bothered me. If you care about Dylan, you're going to stick around. If you don't care about Dylan, you should stick around, because Dylan is extremely important to the shape of life after his arrival on the scene. Let me just give you a few quick clues as to what I thought was really good about the movie. Number one, Timothée Chalamet, or is it Timothée Chalamet, does an absolutely great version of Bob Dylan. His Bob Dylan is pretty much definitive for this period. My shame is that the film, it's trying to put too much into too little. Even though the film is well over 2 hours long, it should have been divided in two, but I'll come to that in a moment. I also thought Elle Fanning did a surprisingly good job as a woman called Sylvie Rosso. She did a character that was essentially the same as Susie Rotolo. And as one person has said, it's the same character in everything but name, but Dylan himself did not want her name used for whatever reason. And then there's Monica Barbaro does an absolutely astounding job as Joan Baez. She manages to capture this kind of folky essence from the early part of the 1960s. She was considered like this folky goddess, and she is a figure that has unfortunately been she's still alive, but she's been kind of cast off in history because she was so earnest in her sound, and her sound was this very pure soprano voice, a lot of vibrato, just playing the guitar. She was always the authentic folky, involved with social justice and all of these things. But she had a personal sense of humor, but that sense of humor didn't come out too much in her music at all. And so I think over time, as much, shall we say, darker, more ironic, more convoluted forms of music came along, that era has kind of receded in public consciousness. Maybe this film will help to bring it back. We'll see. Not that I'm wanting it one way or another. But Monica Barbaro does an absolutely, not an imitation of her, but she gives the essence of why Joan Baez was so important in that early period. And the film does a good job of setting the scene. Now, my feeling is that the film, but while being long, isn't long enough. It should have been 2 movies, and it should have been broken down in the following ways. I think the early part of this film was pretty good, and then there is a point at which it suddenly jumps from 1964 to 1965, and there's a sign that says 1965. We've jumped something. My feeling is that they should have made those 2 separate films. The first part should have been Bob Dylan's arrival in New York City up until Kennedy's death. Now, most people don't realize how important Kennedy's death was, not only to Bob Dylan, but to everything in the culture afterwards. I'm not going to go into that. I've done that on my How We Got Here series, which is on my Anadromist channel. But essentially, what Kennedy's death did to Bob Dylan was, up to that moment, he wrote, for instance, The Times They Are a-Changin' before Kennedy's death. There was a sense of things changing, and that people should learn to live a new way. But immediately after Kennedy's death, he was invited to go speak at the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which was this very left-wing thing. I think people worried about their rights being taken away and all of this stuff. All the left-wing causes in the world put into there, the people involved very left-wing. They wanted Dylan to be the voice of a generation. And Dylan went to that thing and he gave some sort of speech where, and you can see this, it's very well demonstrated in Martin Scorsese's documentary, No Direction Home. And a lot of what I'm going to be comparing this film to is documentaries like No Direction Home, Don't Look Back, Eat the Document, which is extremely rare. You can't really find a copy of it, but I have seen, I had a bootleg VHS of it for a while. Also, Newport Festival documentaries. Again, all of this stuff is very familiar to me. So I understand the order of events and the people, the personas involved. But basically, Dylan, at that time, turns on the left-wing people. And even though the album and the music for it came out after Kennedy's death, it was written before his death. And so the real reaction of Dylan to Kennedy's death comes out with the next album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, which is where he starts going into Mr. Tambourine Man, Subterranean Seasick Blues, all of these things, much more surrealistic, beat-inspired lyrics. So, one of the things that this movie did was it missed an awful lot. It shows Pete Seeger in the beginning. Edward Norton does a great job of playing Pete Seeger. I would have never imagined that Edward Norton could do that. And he is up for an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, as is Monica Barbaro, as is Timothée Chalamet, all rightly so. They really make this movie. One of the things they don't discuss, they have Pete Seeger doing one of his testifying in front of a Senate committee. There was all of this stuff. They wanted him to name names and stuff. And I believe that was completely anachronistic. This happened much earlier than the early 60s. Pete Seeger was a bona fide communist. He wasn't like someone else. His big claim to fame was that he wouldn't name names. This isn't mentioned, though, and that's really important. The tension between the folky lefties and Dylan, who's more of a free spirit, is brought up, but not pointing out exactly how. They make it like all the folkies are over here and they're doing the protesting and stuff, but they're not pointing out how left-wing this was. And Dylan isn't right-wing, but Dylan is something else, and they can't control him, which is true. Also, the next big moment that I was expecting, if you know anything about Dylan's career, you know that it was Peter, Paul, and Mary, a more commercial folk revival group at the beginning of the 60s, were the ones who sang Blowin' in the Wind and made Dylan. This isn't mentioned either, and although Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary is mentioned in the film, but this moment isn't. They make it seem like Joan Baez is the one who made Dylan. Joan Baez certainly helped, but it was Peter, Paul, and Mary that made him famous before his music was spread too far and wide. Also, there's no mention of the Beats, what some people know as the Beatniks, the Beat movement, particularly focusing on Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs. Dylan knew their work very well, and it is in fact their poetry and writing which influenced Dylan quite a bit. For instance, in the beginning of this movie, they show Dylan hitchhiking. Well, that comes straight out of Jack Kerouac's writing. He's always on the road. He's always talking about hitchhiking and such, which was a very weird thing to do in the 1950s, although not nearly as dangerous as it would be by the mid-1970s. But, so most importantly, there's no Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg became like this strange figure in Dylan's life. I think Ginsberg definitely wanted Bob Dylan as this nubile young guy. I mean, he pretty much makes it clear in the documentaries I've seen. Also, another person related to the Beats was the poet Michael McClure. He doesn't show up in the film whatsoever. And this is where a longer version, I think the first part of this film, up until Kennedy's death and the National Committee of Civil Liberties emergency committee thing, that's where it should have ended. It should have been 2 hours plus, and then you would have had more characters, because you needed more to understand this world. They did have John Hammond, they did have Albert Grossman, they didn't have, for instance, Phil Oakes. They didn't really get into the folky scene and how Dylan came and both energized the scene and took all the glory. Very interesting, because it had been going on for several years before Dylan arrived in New York City. They did mention Johnny Cash, and I thought those were some of the best parts of the film. It shows Johnny Cash as a very, being Johnny Cash, but also his darkest part before he reformed himself and really committed himself to Christianity. And there is a very interesting scene of Dylan playing The Times They Are A-Changin at the Newport Folk Festival in '64. And they make that a very important moment because Dylan is no longer that person who is writing all these protest songs. And you get this sense that it's done very well, where he's connected. He looks at the audience, they don't understand what he means. And the truth is, the lines, "Don't speak too soon because the wheel is still in spin," is every bit as true now as it was then. Dylan wasn't singing for this brave new utopian world. And this is especially true by 1964. But I would have liked to have seen, for instance, Phil Ochs in there. Phil Ochs was maybe number 2 or 3 in the folky world as far as someone kind of related on Bob Dylan's level as a singer. And there's a great moment in Dylan and Phil Ochs' relationship, which would have come out if I was making this film, it would have been in the second part, where Dylan kicks him out of the car, and Phil Ochs comes to realize Dylan is being controlled, as he says, he's being controlled by these really manipulative forces. And he's talking about the commercial industry, but he's also talking about Dylan's commitment to this kind of... Dylan isn't a full-blown psychedelic warrior or anything, but he certainly, early on the scene, he did do a bit of experimenting with LSD, and he did a bit of he certainly smoked marijuana, and in fact later passed it on to the Beatles, who got their involvement in drugs from Dylan. So I think that more of the folky scene would have been better in a longer version of this. That, for me, would be the end of the first part, which would be the showing the folky scene more, showing Peter, Paul, and Mary, showing Allen Ginsberg, showing all the left-wing forces who wanted Dylan. For instance, they didn't show Dylan singing many protest songs at all, which he was famous for in the beginning. They didn't really get into that part of his lyric writing. And then, in my version, the second part would have begun with the Beatles. That is to say, because literally the Beatles arrive within a month and a half of Kennedy's assassination. They take over America. Later in 64, Dylan meets the Beatles, and he's inspired by them to pick up the electric guitar. And in No Direction Home, there's a guy who talks about exactly the moment after Dylan has seen the Beatles play, where he starts looking at electric guitars in New York City. So Dylan is inspired to get an electric guitar. But when he talks to them, they're inspired by his songwriting. But then he says, you guys aren't singing about anything. You're singing these love songs. You're saying, you guys need to grow up and sing some good songs, which is the main impetus for the Beatles to change. This is something that seems to be overlooked. As much as I like The Rest is History, Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook, they completely, when doing their episode on the Beatles, did not mention anything about Bob Dylan. Andy Edwards on his channel really understands this, though. He understands, and he's British, but he understands there is no second half of the Beatles without Bob Dylan. And this really should have been brought out. Also, another thing that's missing, and you can see this in any Dylan interview footage, particularly after Kennedy's death, Dylan has a fantastic sense of humor. Timothée Chalamet did an absolutely amazing job, except for the fact Dylan's humor is something very, very funny. He's often saying things that are really funny in his interviews, particularly in 64, 65. And I would say that was something that was really missing. Also, in the flash forward, you kind of skip through what I would consider the heart of the whole story, which is Dylan's transformation from folky protest singer to surrealist poet, essentially, beat surrealist poet. This absolutely unique figure. There's no mention of, Dylan's writing is just all mysterious and stuff, which I'm sure Dylan was fine with, because Dylan hates to talk about his songwriting. But one of the things that happens, there's a very important character who gets thrown into the mix. We've met Pete Seeger, we've met Albert Grossman, who is Dylan's rather ferocious manager. Great performance in the film here. But Bob Newirth was this very interesting sidekick character to Dylan. you start seeing him, particularly when you get to the Newport Folk Festival of '65, and Dylan's going to blow everyone away with all this electric music. But you see him acting. You see that he and Dylan have formed this symbiotic relationship. Neuwirth was kind of a very low-grade folk performer, which I think Dylan liked because Dylan didn't really like to be upstaged. But nevertheless, they have this very interesting thing where it's like they kind of know. That whole relationship is not explored, and that's a very fascinating relationship. Again, in my two-part, so the second part would be much longer. It would be like a 2.5. There should be 2.5-hour movies rather than one 2.5-hour movie. Also, when we get to the Newport Folk Festival, and Dylan is doing, ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more. They actually borrow a bit, which I can understand because it's such a juicy quote. Later in the year, Dylan goes to London, and someone in the audience sees him playing the electric guitar, and he's about to start playing Like a Rolling Stone, and someone hollers out, "Judas!" And Dylan goes, "You're lying." It's just like, and then launches into this great version of Like a Rolling Stone. Well, they took that and put it in the Newport Folk Festival, where it certainly didn't belong. And yet I understand that. It was a great point. If you're going to make a Bob Dylan movie, that's a great line to throw in there. But the film, it hovers around the mystery of Bob Dylan. Here's the mystery of Bob Dylan. This guy who kind of invents himself. No one even knows he's really Robert Zimmerman. He takes his last name from the poet Dylan Thomas. He writes these excruciatingly beautiful songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, and all these other songs from his early career. And yet, he's, by the movie's own admission, a bit of an asshole, to say the least. And this is the mystery. How can this guy be both of these things? And I think that is a very tough thing to do. No one knows how to approach that yet. I think eventually someone will figure it out in a film. Also, they should have spent more time in the long version that I imagine in my head. They should have spent more time in the recording studios particularly for Highway 61 Revisited. And they show the engineer, Tom Johnson, who's this black guy who's been producing and recording all these great jazz musicians. But they don't really explore that relationship that much. And they should have. And I'm not saying this because you need more representation. I'm saying that because it's an important aspect of the story. And how did Dylan learn from him to use the studio? Because Dylan did learn from him about using the studio. So, but I would have spent more time on the recording sessions in this imagined longer version. And here's the thing. The movie basically kind of stops after the Newport Folk Festival. Whereas I'm sitting there saying, and I think anyone who knows the Bob Dylan story, and they allude to it at the end by showing Dylan on a motorcycle, know that the story should end with a motorcycle accident. Because that is where Dylan's whole career changes. And at that point, he steps out for about a year and a half, and there's a lot of other stuff that then happens. Because then you get to Dylan in late 65 and 66. He's become this Messiah-like figure to people, and you see the change. They do a great job of showing the change from Bob Dylan being this kind of like, hey, I'm Bob Dylan wandering around, to being this person who suddenly can't be alone because everyone recognizes him. But if you watch the film footage used for the concerts in Martin Scorsese's No Direction Home, you will see Dylan is going into these weird, almost trance-like states where he's just kind of like his eyes start going back and forth, and he's playing these really long, endless harmonica solos, and he's just in this weird space. Is it drugs? Maybe, but I don't think that's really it. And I think Phil Oakes' phrase that there are these tremendous forces at work on Dylan, Phil Oakes would later off himself. And there's a whole story right there But when Dylan kicks him out of the car, I think that's the moment where we see the forces at work on Dylan. And however you'd see those forces as commercial or spiritual or whatever, I think that's it. And one of the things about Bob Dylan is he essentially changes the world through his songs. There would be no second half of the Beatles' career, who influenced everybody else. There would be no prog rock as we know it because of the Beatles. There would be no Jimi Hendrix, who was a massive Bob Dylan fan, and in fact did his own versions of course, Like a Rolling Stone and All Along the Watchtower. Jimi Hendrix took Bob Dylan's approach to lyrics and this new approach to music, and then said, oh, I can apply this to the guitar and to recording. And would there be a heavy metal then without that? Would there be psychedelic? There wouldn't be any folk rock and psychedelic rock without Dylan's transformation. There wouldn't be, lots of really terrible lyrics too, but there wouldn't be any social awareness within the punk movement without Dylan. There wouldn't be most of the singers in the 1970s who were on the rock spectrum wouldn't be there. There wouldn't be a Lou Reed. There wouldn't be punk rock. There wouldn't be grunge music, therefore. Essentially, Dylan affects the absolute rest of rock history until its demise in the late 90s into a kind of just blatant commercialism. So I wanted to see more of that mystery, but they did actually a fairly good job. So it's the motorcycle accident, and I think had they hinted at the effect Dylan would have on everything else, that would have been the way to end the film. The combination of Dylan becoming stranger to himself even, of Dylan's motorcycle accident, and then Dylan's effect upon the world. Some sort of even just hint of what that would mean. That would have been the way I would have ended a 2-part, 5-hour movie or television series or whatever. But having said that, you should still go see this movie. It's the closest we're probably going to get to someone trying to wrestle with the meaning of early Bob Dylan. Timothée Chalamet is absolutely, if he wins the Academy Award, I'd be completely thrilled, because he also did a great job in Dune Part 2 earlier in the year. They portrayed things in a very good light, with the exception of hiding some of the communist elements. They made sure that they were kind of lefty social justice people, but there were a lot of communists, real communists, not just socialist types, hanging out in the folky demi-monde. And actually showing the failure in the end of the folky world as Dylan's brand of rock music began to take over. And they hinted that very strongly at the end. Go see the film. It will at least entice you to understand more of the history. And best of all, maybe get you to pick up a few great Dylan albums like Freewheeling, Another Side of Bob Dylan, Times They Are a-Changin, and especially Highway 61 Revisited, and then you can go on to his, some people, they used to call this his greatest album, Blonde on Blonde. But I think now everyone knows it's Highway 61 Revisited, which is where everything happens. Okay, put a fork in me. I'm done. And think about the meaning of the music you listen to and the meaning of the times we're in. So this is Georgia. No, it isn't. So this is Bern in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the middle of the Caucasus Mountains, where I had a chance to finally see A Complete Unknown by James Mangold, saying, as the Georgians say when they leave, droebit, which just means temporarily, but it implies we'll just be gone from each other a little while, and then we will meet again.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
It's here, rescued from Alaska. This year, my first ever book, 3 Motions. Motions is an old English word for puppet shows. Indeed, there are 3 puppet plays here written by myself for my Alaskan puppetry classes, including my versions of the medieval classic Everyman, cleverly entitled Every Puppet, and even better, my retelling of the Faust legend, updated for the 21st century, also very cleverly, with a special introductory essay on the meaning of puppetry. Now, are these 50-page booklets physically worth the $25 price? No. But this isn't about material possessions. This is about being part of this odd channel and whatever it is we're doing here, trying to understand things. And these little booklets are unique. Each one is numbered and signed by yours truly. When they sell out, they are gone. I will never reprint them. Special deals if you want multiple copies for a production of your own. Just let me know you're doing it. That's $25 for the USA, Canada, Mexico, most of Europe. There may be some corners, like, I don't know, Russia, etc., and might require some extra money, as would Asia, Latin America, and Africa, or Tonga, or Australia probably. I'll have to add another $5 or so, depending on where you're from. But part of the money goes to my assistants who are shipping these from me from their respective American and European locations. Use the links below, PayPal, GoFundMe, and make sure you add the word book, B-O-O-K, book, to let me know this is not just a normal contribution to the channel, which you can still make. This book will not last long. Help me keep the channel alive. I get no other funding except from you, the viewer. I don't get it from YouTube. I don't get sponsorships. It's up to you. If you appreciate what I do on this channel, get a book. It's a great way to remember what this channel was about, and it'll be something unique because they're all signed and numbered.
Tell me about the songs that you've sung, that you've written yourself, that you sing.
Oh, those are... Well, I don't claim to call them folk songs or anything. I just call them contemporary songs, I guess. You know, a lot of people paint. You know, if they got something that's they want to say, you know, they paint. Or other people write. Well, I just write a song, you know, same thing. So, want to hear one?
Why, yes, that's just what I had in mind, Bob Dylan. Whatever made you think of that?
Let's see, what kind you want to hear? 'Cause I got a new one I wrote.